welcome everybody. Thank you all for being here on a cold December night for the last program, the last Lowell program of the year at the aquarium. Thank you for your support, and for many of you that have been coming regularly, I greatly appreciate your continued support and participation. Also, thanks to the Lowell Institute that funds these programs. They're a longtime supporter of public education programs at the aquarium and are sponsor of the Lowell Environmental Writers Series. This series is a new program. It's slightly different from the Lowell Lecture Series. We used to have a program called the Environmental Writers Festival, which was a long weekend and invited a whole bunch of writers and a whole bunch of people interested in environmental writings. Did any of you participate in one of those? Okay, so some of you are familiar. I am trying this in a different way, and periodically throughout the year, I will invite environmental writers, and if you have suggestions of people that you'd like me to invite, I encourage you to note them on a suggestion form at the table on where you registered when you came in. And I will periodically through the year invite writers to come. A few logistical notes. If you parked in this garage, please walk over to the IMAX Theater lobby and get your ticket validated. That will make it a reduced price. If you need a bathroom, they're right out this door just around the corner. I do encourage you to give me feedback for future programs to improve them and keep them as good as they can be. If you have a cell phone or something that might make noise during the program, please take a moment and turn it off. And this presentation and several others are being videotaped so they can be made available via the internet. And on the web page where you registered, there is a link to the place where you can look at lectures that you may want to go back and listen to again, or you may have missed and that you were interested in. So please look for that if that's of interest. Without further ado, I want to introduce this evening's speaker, Dave Martin. When Dave was about 7 years old, his family purchased a boat named Martini and used it as a day sailor in Lake Washington out in Seattle. Dave remembers clinging to the rail, worrying about tipping over at the slightest heel, saying, "We're going to tip over, we're going to drown." But a couple years later at 9, he started learning to sail in a sailing program. And by 14, he was racing in Puget Sound as one of the youngest crew members out in the team's racing. So he took to sailing quite early and well. His father encouraged him to find something he could do well and really get into it. And so he did. In his 20s, Dave rebuilt the Martini and gave it a new name, Direction. And that was the boat that he'd then eventually sail around the world in. Along the way, he met Jaja, and they did a lot of sailing together. And eventually, they had started having some children, and they kept sailing. And in June of 1996, they were living on land and decided to take a turn off the typical pathway of landside life and travel a very different path. Somewhat familiar, but with 3 children, that makes it a little different, I suspect. I'm quite confident. So, here at the aquarium, our mission is to present, promote, and protect the world of water. But not very many of us have lived as close to the ocean for as long as Dave and his family have. So it's really a delight to have Dave here to present some of the stories and the philosophy and the reasons for making the kinds of choices that they've made to live very close to the ocean. Please join me in welcoming Dave Martin.
Yeah. That's great. Thanks. Yeah. Thank you, John. Yeah, thanks to John and the aquarium for inviting us down. I say myself, Jaja, who normally accompanies me, is unable to make it tonight due to her mother having a long illness. So she's in New Jersey tonight, and sends her apologies for not being here. I have my daughter Tiga with me, the family contingent, who's coloring in the front row, and has seen this presentation so many times she doesn't even need to look at it, and she'll probably correct me if I say something wrong. I'd like to take just 1 minute to thank a friend of mine who's here tonight, Gail Anderson, freelance editor who we got hooked up with when we wrote our book. And Gail and I worked together for 2 years creating our book, Into the Light. And I have to thank you very much for that. And Gail was instrumental in getting our speaking engagements lined up this year, all of our own accord, and just as a just because she's a nice person, did it for us. What else can I say? Yeah. And so I have to say thank you to Gail. That's really the reason why we're here. My slideshow. I have tried to avoid using travelogue as the venue to tell a story about what is eventually a travelogue, going from point A to point B on a sailboat. And to do that, I've kind of scrambled things up a little bit, and I actually talk about two voyages. One, I kind of digressed about the voyage on our 25-foot boat, Direction, as John mentioned, that I rebuilt when I was 20, the boat we sailed around the world. So when you see pictures of the warm, nice tropics, which is where we should all be now, that's the Direction. And the main story, the voyage we made to the ice on our 33-foot sailboat, Driver. When you see cold pictures and say, why aren't you in the tropics, then you know we're aboard Driver. So, John, I think I'm going to close these doors. Yeah. Okay. Yes. This is a much younger version of the person who's standing here tonight. And anyway, everyday life is like a road with many options. The off-ramps lead smoothly away from the main highway in almost any direction. But sometimes the road forks abruptly, and you stop and consider your options. Which way now? Do I stick to the known route, or do I take a chance that the side road will also work? Well, in 1998, Jaja and I took a sharp turn off the main route and headed down the road to adventure. The highway we left behind was smooth and continued toward a convenient life on shore. The pavement was smooth and well-traveled, and with bold yellow lines to guide us. Billboards in the distance advertised creature comfort and long-term security. But the road we chose instead was unpaved and full of pitfalls with few signs to guide us. Why were we willing to rough it and take risks? What were the rewards? We considered ourselves treasure hunters. We suspected if we ignored creature comfort and long-term security that the riches of nature and diverse culture awaited us. And so began our voyage to Iceland and beyond. By this time in our lives, Jaja and I had been married 10 years and had 3 children. And when we left the States on our 33-foot steel sloop Driver, we didn't really have any specific plans. Our objective was just to sail to Iceland. We figured if we could do that, just make it to Iceland with our kids, our lust for adventure would finally be sated. And that was actually a foolish thing to think. In the far north, the distances between countries are relatively short. And with an average speed of 5.5 knots, we could get from place to place in about 3 to 5 days. Problem with the high latitudes is the summer sailing season is pretty short, mid-June to say late August. Of course, you'll still get 35-knot gales in the summer months. The advantage is, of course, that the rain is warmer. Getting to the high latitudes from the States can take all summer if you don't just knuckle down and go for it. And since we were eager to get to Iceland as early in the season as possible, we set sail from Bermuda in May 1998 on a 2,700-mile nonstop passage to Iceland. And this is the last we saw of the sweet tropics for a number of years. Well, the excitement of beginning that long passage to Iceland diminished somewhat when our 2-year-old, Tiga, vomited all over Jaja. And the high of getting that mess cleaned up was annulled 5 minutes later when our 6-year-old Holly vomited all over Tiga. And the episode continued when our 8-year-old Chris made a beeline for the cockpit, but didn't quite make it in time and coated the bulkhead, the cabin sole, and my new rain gear with his breakfast. And by the time we had those messes cleaned up, we were wondering if they had yacht brokers in Iceland. About 2 weeks into the passage to Iceland, we got nailed by a late spring gale. But by that time, we'd made peace with the sea. Seasickness was a thing of the past. The driver was riding the conditions well, and there was no reason to feel threatened. There were no shoals in the area, and there were no currents to create adverse sea conditions. I don't want to give the impression that we were complacent, but as far as storms go, it was a fairly routine mid-ocean inconvenience. Well, during the height of this 45-knot gale, I lifted the floorboards and noticed that seawater was seeping into the bilge. There was no doubt about it. We were definitely sinking. There we were, at 54 North, with our small kids on a leaky boat. And as you can imagine, our level of complacency took a turn for the worse. Began wondering if the leak was an isolated event or if it was the first link in a greater catastrophe, because considering our latitude, more storms were given, the hull would be stressed, tweaked, and flexed further. Well, it took about 24 hours to locate this leak, which turned out to be a 2-inch crack below the waterline. During that stressful search, during this search for the leak, we wondered if we should initiate an abandoned ship procedure. Wondered if we should use all of our remaining time on the boat for the sole purpose of getting rescued instead of perhaps looking for a leak. Instead of doing anything rash, we contained our anxiety by looking at the situation objectively. We thought, were we in a life-threatening situation, or due to our mild fear, did we only perceive that it was a life-threatening situation? That one's always a little bit blurry. For me, survival is a state of mind. It's the way I choose to look at my situation. Am I going to be a victor, or am I going to be a victim? Being safe at sea is much more than installing devices that will assist me in abandoning my boat. Buying all the latest and greatest safety gear increases one's confidence offshore. That's a good thing. However, it's important to remember that owning safety equipment is not going to decrease the odds of encountering gales or any other shipboard problems. Well, to me, safety at sea means I've focused on stout rigging and an inventory of strong sails. It means I've loaded my boat with good clothing, warm bedding, and nutritional food. It means I have quality paper charts, then I can navigate like my son here with a sextant. Another aspect of self-sufficiency is having a vast collection of spare parts, both specific and replacements and odds and ends, as you just see here. Screws, wire, tape, hose clamps, and of course the sailor's friend, epoxy. I feel that with a little ingenuity, you can fix just about anything, especially when you have to. Well, I fixed the leak in the hull after we found it with a plywood patch and a polysulfide waterproof sealant, and it had to hold until we got in. And then a few days later, after 24 days at sea, we spied the snow-capped mountains of Iceland, and of course that meant ice cream. We later found a place to gird out the boat and wait for the tide to fall so that we could repair the crack to the hull. I borrowed a welding machine and snaked the cord down the ramp as the tide fell, well aware that with 220 amps buzzing around my feet, I had to work quickly before the tide came back in. It's nothing like a little inspiration to make you do something quickly. Well, in Reykjavik, the main harbor in Iceland, locals asked the familiar questions. Where did we come from? How many days en route? And any bad storms? Fishermen said we were nuts to sail our tiny boat all the way across the Atlantic to Iceland. What were we thinking? Their trepidation surprised me, considering the rough and tumble waters they routinely fish in, but I just figured their amazement was due to their lack of understanding of sailboats. Voyaging is like anything else in life. You advance little by little to certain levels of experience and confidence. We all have different thresholds for adventure, and I've learned that it's pointless to get discouraged when someone tells you that your seafaring plans are foolish. Basically, the more radical your itinerary or the smaller your boat is, the more questioning looks you're likely to get. Well, as John mentioned, my sailing experiences began when I was 7 years old. And it's true, I was scared out of my wits every time the boat heeled in the wind. I'd cling to the gunwale and I'd actually shout, "Daddy, Daddy, we're going to die." Coincidentally, Jaja also began to sail at age 7. And now here's the sole difference in our personalities. When her boat heeled in the wind, she'd shout to her father, "Daddy, make it tip farther." Well, I conquered my fears by getting involved with round the buoy racing and then going offshore with deliveries, step by step, nice and rational. I know what fears are made of, but this helps me to prepare my boats for sea. Jaja, on the other hand, doesn't have any fears, and that's why we work well together. The yin and the yang, we tend to keep each other in check. Let's do this. Oh, we can't do that. Let's do that. Oh, we can't do that. And then we kind of hit this middle of the road compromise and everything works out perfectly. Now, when you tell your family and friends that you're going to sell your house, the farm, buy a boat and sail to the tropics, everyone goes, "Oh, geez, that's great. I wish I could do that." You're the model of envy. Tell them you're going to sail to the Arctic, and you get this stony politeness, and the eyebrows go up, and say, "May I ask why you're not sailing to the tropics like normal cruisers?" Translate, are you out of your mind? Well, no one encouraged our Icelandic plans, and that's the truth. But it didn't matter. In fact, we've learned that when our outlandish ideas are challenged, we know we must be doing the right thing. Well, the confidence that we gained, which enabled us to sail to Iceland with our 3 small kids, as you see here at the beginning of the voyage, grew its real roots a decade earlier. And I'm now going to digress from the main theme for a minute and turn the calendar back to 1985. I was 20, living alone, rebuilding my first boat. It was a 25-foot fiberglass sloop. And as John said, I named the boat Direction. And I named it Direction because that is the one thing in life every young man must possess. During the reconstruction, I beefed up the hull with extra fiberglass, tore out the cockpit, rebuilt the rudder, rebuilt the mast, basically turned it into a Niagara Falls barrel and make it a safe ocean-going boat. Redesigned the interior to accommodate a lot of stores and also to sleep 2 people comfortably. In the back of my mind, although I was going to set off to go around the world alone, I was hoping to find a mate to go with me. And when the boat was finished, I headed south to the Caribbean. And it was some short time later that I met Jaja, my Surfasaurus. She was working at a hotel in St. John, USVI, teaching sailing. She'd never been on a proper cruising boat before. She was used to Hobie Cats, lasers, and 470s. She'd never been on a boat with a cabin. It's a Wahoo on the back deck, you can see there. First time she went aboard Direction, she was amazed. She said, "Wow, this is great. There's a sink and beds and a toilet. And this is great. 2 people could live in here perfectly. This is awesome." Well, needless to say, I was careful not to let Jaja go aboard larger boats until we were married. Well, from the Caribbean, I sailed Direction solo across the Atlantic, something I'd always wanted to do. But Jaja flew to England to meet me, and it was from there, 1988, that we began our voyage around the world together. You're supposed to go, "Aw, look at that." Yeah. Incidentally, our departure from England marked the beginning of Jaja's ocean sailing experiences. And for her first experience, I was taking her across the Bay of Biscay in October, which tends to be a bit late in the season on a 25-foot boat, but we were having such a good time on pub crawls that we kind of lost track of the time. However, Jaja amazed me on this passage. Although I was hoping it wouldn't be too rough for her to get discouraged, she amazed me because she was the first person I'd ever met who didn't routinely get seasick. There I was in the cold cockpit, rolling my head miserably. She was below in the cabin, singing happily and offering me food. Well, back in the Caribbean a few months later, we were married on the island of Barbados by a West Indian magistrate. We eloped. And one of the best things about being married, it was finally safe for us to socialize with people living on bigger boats. Well, after our transit of the Panama Canal into the Pacific, which back in 1989 cost $60, it costs several thousand now, we set off across the wide Pacific. During our 23-day crossing to the Galapagos and on to the Marquesas, we talked about our future. We figured we'd be back in the States in a year or two. And we talked about children. One of the foundations of our marriage was having kids. And we agreed that 2 kids would be perfect. Moreover, we agreed that we would definitely not have kids while living on the boat because that would be impossible, not to mention irresponsible. So we had it all worked out. We were going to sail around the world, haul back into the States, move ashore, have kids. Plan A. Now, as Jaja's pregnancy advanced, and her stomach began to resemble a well-set spinnaker, she wondered if she was going to be able to get in and out of directions, tiny doorway, the companionway. You had to bend your knees pretty tight and bend over to get into that sucker. But a pregnancy was one of the things I neglected to take into consideration when I rebuilt the boat as a 20-year-old. But a guy can't be expected to think of everything, or should he? Always eager to find solutions, I said to Jaja, "Don't worry, honey. Things get uncomfortable, I'll just tie a rope under your arms and winch you in and out of the foredeck hatch." Well, pregnant and broke, we headed to Australia to have the baby. And despite the worry of what our sailing future held, Jaja and I were feeling pretty savvy. Since our departure from England 15 months earlier, we'd logged 15,000 miles and had visited 16 countries. And except for failed birth control, we'd not experienced any other life-threatening gear failures. Yeah, that's my first Father's Day. So after Chris was born in Bundaberg, Australia, we initiated Plan B, which was to find out what it was like to sail with a baby. One of the main ingredients of youth is to see how you react to hardship rather than find ways to avoid it. Although Jaja and I were very naive in the baby department, the other part of our mental programming was to sail around the world. It's what we'd set out to do together. So with nothing to lose for trying, we headed to New Zealand when Chris was 5 months old. Sailing offshore with a baby was a real eye-opener for us. Chris was a wiggle worm and wanted to move around. He hadn't learned yet that moving around at sea is easily accomplished by laying perfectly still. Anyway, the demands of childcare, coupled with the demands of sailing the boat, kept us hopping. It was nighttime crying on the off watch when all we needed to do was get some sleep. And of course, there was the issue of a boat that was battened down tight for sea and dirty diapers. But we survived, and Chris survived. We knew we'd be more comfortable living ashore, but would we be happier? So long as Jaja and I were willing to put up with a few extra hardships, we knew we could continue with our dream to sail around the world and raise a family. Well, just to test how resilient we were, we had Holly 18 months later while living on the boat in New Zealand. Plan B was in full effect. We decided to think of our kids as sails and just raise them along the way. And like all parents do, we began to catalog life's events using the ages of our kids for reference. When Chris was 2 years old and Holly was 5 months old, we set sail from New Zealand, 1,200 miles north of tropical Fiji. This passage would become a turning point in our seafaring life. When we left New Zealand, the forecast called for moderate easterlies, but 2 days into the passage, a occluded front stalled over the top of us, and we were pounded by 40 to 50 knot northeasterlies. When the wind peaked at 50 knots, it held steady and didn't let up for 90 hours. During an ocean tempest, it's helpful to recognize when the storm peaks. Mentally, the worst part of nasty weather is wondering how bad it's going to get. You're contemplating if the boat's going to stay together. But when conditions level off, you can stop worrying about the boat and start concentrating on how best to get through the storm. A well-found boat is tireless, but you, on the other hand, have to do everything possible to conserve energy. Well, after those 90 hours, the storm finally vanished and left us wiped out with still a week of sailing left to get to Fiji. Everything in the cabin was wet and already turning green with mold. But after we made a landfall in Fiji and rested up and cleaned up, we knew that the slide was going to stick. Yeah, let's take a question while I do the slide. People always ask, what do we do for money? See, everyone wants to know what we do for money. It's none of your business. That's what yeah. Along the way on the trip around the world on direction, I'm a boat builder by trade and found work every place I went. One of the facts of life is if you have to work, you will find a job. And I always found work. And recently, we've written a book, and I write magazine articles and sell photographs to magazines. And I'm currently working in a boatyard, making things out of teak every single day. Okay. That's never happened before. It's a good thing I don't get stressed out about stuff like that. That one's backwards. Okay. This is where I left off. We've just made it to Fiji. And we realized that it wasn't so bad looking back on it, you know. We figured if we could survive that ordeal, that we could survive anything. The human spirit has depths beyond imagination, but sometimes it takes a little discomfort to find out all about it. Several years later, after winding our way westward across through Indonesia, as you see here, onward towards South Africa's Cape Agulhas, we set off across the South Atlantic back to Barbados. Another wahoo. We pondered our future once again. We thought, what can we do in life that would be as exciting as raising 2 kids on a 25-foot boat? And little did we know. Anyway, we had plenty of time for examining our options on that 52-day passage to Barbados. In the doldrums, we melted in the sun. And to cool off, we swam off the boat. 3-year-old Holly swam her first solo strokes in 12,000 feet of water. Drifting on the equator was one of the most profound experiences we'd ever had. Without an engine, we watched the sun come up, and we watched the sun go down. And we watched the moon come up and the moon go down. And went around like that for 2 weeks. There was no noise. There were dorados swimming around the boat. And we felt completely connected to our planet And if that doesn't want you to use conservation to control the species of fish life and preserve what we have, nothing will. Anyway, we weren't afraid of sharks. At least Jaja wasn't. I'm the one on deck taking the picture. But she used to jump in the water and swim alongside the boat. So she swim laps, pacing her dismal speed to get exercise. And on one afternoon, she had been swimming for about an hour, and she hopped up back on the deck, and it was about 90 degrees. And she said, "You know, Dave, I'm still hot. I'd give anything to be somewhere cold like Iceland right now." Which just proves you have to be careful what you wish for. Well, as you can see, we're back to the land of fire and ice. A little bit of early spring sailing here. From the Icelandic capital of Reykjavik, after we fixed the hole in the boat, we loaded up with supplies, made a few arrangements with the government to stay and for some small time, and headed off. One of the main objectives of the driver voyage was to be spontaneous. We wanted to avoid the crushing weight of an itinerary that was carved in stone. And as we became captivated by the Icelandic landscape and by the diverse culture, we realized that 6 weeks wasn't going to be enough, that we wanted to stay for the whole winter. So we decided to live on the north coast of Iceland, shown here by the red arrow, the town of Akureyri, up on the 30 miles south of the Arctic Circle. And with the cold, dark winter looming ahead, the Icelanders asked us, "Why aren't you in the tropics like normal cruisers?" But I pointed out that the Icelandic peoples had survived the cold gray seas on open boats and had lived in turf huts for nearly 1,000 years. And I argued that compared to a turf hut, driver was the very embodiment of luxury. This line of reasoning didn't work, as people said, "Yeah, but we live in heated houses now." I know when I'm beat. So I just tried an age-old line of reasoning. I said, it was my wife's idea. Well, the Scandinavians have a saying when they're planning an outing. They say, "There's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing." And this is an attitude as much as a fact. And it's a good attitude, too, especially when you live in a winter climate and you only have a sled to use for running errands. It's interesting to note that in the northern countries where gas costs $4 a gallon, families often survive, mind you, with one car and get around on these kick sleds. It's a shame that it takes a high price for fuel to inspire us to use less of it, but this is the culture we live in. Before sailing to Iceland, we didn't go crazy buying expensive expedition outdoor quality gear. We just had regular stuff, stuff bought at Walmart and other local retailers. And most of the stuff we accumulated along the way as our needs grew and our kids grew. Anyway, we had no idea we were going to stay the winter when we set sail for Iceland, so we had to buy the stuff. And the Icelanders have been buying stuff there for quite a number of years, and we bought their stuff, and it was pretty good. Now, I have to mention here that Tiga, age 3 here, had heard all about this phenomenon called a white sand beach from her brother and her sister and seen all the pictures. And we didn't bother explaining the difference to her. We just gave her a shovel and a pair of skis, and she's got it figured out. The advantage of living aboard a boat is that you're never far from the warm cabin. The driver was our cocoon, our life support system, as it were. It's much different from camping in the wilderness when you're days away from a reliable heat source. And for onboard heat, I installed a Dickinson natural draft diesel stove, which worked very similarly to a wood-burning stove. When the temperature dropped to extreme levels, as you can see here, we're able to maintain a 65, 70 degree cabin temperature. The diesel is gravity fed out of a day tank into the main tank of the stove. I wanted to do this so that we didn't have to rely on electricity for our heating system. Our batteries were charged with solar panels and by wind, and we wanted to maintain what little charge we could get in the dark winters. When we bought the boat, we ripped it to pieces, basically. It was the smallest boat we could comfortably fit into, but the interior was inadequate for our growing family, so we just ripped it all out because it's easier to get what you want working from scratch. Houses have a similar philosophy. I designed the interior for cold weather sailing, insulated the hull, and made overhead panels to shed condensation away from our living space to the hull, where it could run unimpeded behind lockers and into the bilge and keep our possessions dry. This became the finished product. Anyway, as the winter wore on, we met Atta and her husband Gudni, a couple of local Icelanders. Our son Chris and their daughter Maria were third grade classmates in the local school system. We had enrolled Holly and Chris in Akureyri's school so that they would have contact with kids their own age and have the opportunity to learn a foreign language. Homeschooling would have isolated them too much on the boat, especially in a foreign culture. And as a bonus, we met other parents during school functions, and it turned out to be a great way to learn about local customs. Food is a huge part of Icelandic tradition, and Atta and Gudni wanted to educate us. Although fish is the backbone of the Icelandic heritage and balances the scales of the economy, there are many other dishes, such as pork and lamb, which are favorites at Christmas time. During one meal, we sat at their house, and our mouths watered when we saw pickled purple cabbages and white sauces and homemade breads and fish that had been steamed and dried and baked. This is the Norwegian dried torsk, or the dried cod. And next to the fish, there was some pork. Next to the pork, there was some lamb, and the most recognizable body part on display from the lamb was the head. The sheep's dirty yellow teeth were illuminated by the candlelight. There was also a lamb's leg, quite possibly the front leg, I wasn't really sure. Next to the lamb leg and the head was a cold lamb roast called hangikjöt, which translates to smoked meat, hanging meat, and quite frankly, it was the best meat I'd ever tasted. When the ram's testicle pate was passed around, Jaja helped herself to some, but I had another helping of the smoked meat instead. Our host smiled after I had eaten 2 platefuls of this. He said most tourists didn't like the smoked meat, especially when they discovered that it had been smoked using sheep's poop, which, if you think about it, is a very eco-friendly way to preserve your food. Well, about halfway through the winter, as you see here, is a 11 o'clock sunrise in late January. And we became more close to Atta and Gudni. They confided to us that they'd become the authorities on the Americans living on the boat. Women would come into Atta's pharmacy and ask how the children were doing on driver. Well, our kids were, of course, going to school, and if they weren't on our boat with their friends, they went off to other friends' homes. They were taking art lessons and music lessons, just kind of any run-of-the-mill thing kids like to do. And men would come into Gudni's hydraulics hardware store and ask if there was anything that I needed, anything at all. Gudni explained that this interest in our life and the need and the want to help us, although somewhat surreptitious, was a sign of respect The Icelanders respected that we were dealing with life on our own terms. Icelanders are independent, and they're proud, and they cherish this quality in others. But we were doing pretty well, even during this 60-knot blizzard. You have to get out and take pictures when the weather's extreme. If you take pictures when it's not extreme, it doesn't look half as exciting. Well, as the springtime wore on, we'd sit in the cockpit and look at the mountain behind the boat there. That's called Sulu, 2,300 feet. The kids' school is that big square building behind the church. And boy, I just wanted to climb that mountain. I could see myself up there enjoying the blue sky view, and I was just waiting for springtime to get up there. But unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to climb that mountain. Well, just like the mountain springs that were beginning to thaw again, it was time for us to be moving on as well. We briefly thought of heading south, but our brains had contracted the virus known as Arctic fever. And despite the reality of another chilly summer, we decided to keep going north instead of going south. The high latitude regions, we just couldn't get enough of them. So we headed eastward towards Norway and found summertime. We wandered up the Norwegian coast, ducking in and out of the protective islands. Anchorages were everywhere, and the ocean swell was almost forgotten in the protective channels. It was so easy to make miles that by late August, we were well over 100 miles north of the Arctic Circle and cruising in a region known as the Lofoten Islands, located at 68 north. And this was one of the most spectacular regions we ever had discovered. It even had white sand beaches there. Mountains rose steeply from the sea. And the pace of life of the people ashore matched our relatively comatose existence on Driver. People were just living their lives. They had time for their friends and time for their kids, and basically enjoying themselves. We found a safe berth for Driver in the local marina underneath this 1,800-foot peak. We actually did climb this one. Now that we were 120 miles north of the Arctic Circle, the sun was going to be gone from the skies from early December to late January. We're about to experience total winter darkness. At the local grammar school, a 5-minute walk from the boat, we enrolled Holly and Chris in the 3rd and 4th grades. By going to the local school, our kids were able to see how kids on shore did things. Although we were happy we could give our children a taste of adventure on Driver, we also thought it was important to give them a taste of shoreside normalcy. It was a thrill to watch our young children excel. After just 3 months in Norwegian school, Holly and Chris began to speak it like locals. Jaja and I struggled with Norwegian, but our children's proficiency in Icelandic had given them a good head start. Holly and Chris had always been close, but it was a little disconcerting when we realized that they could now communicate with each other, and we had no idea what they were saying about us. Well, the price for our marina slip was $17 a month, including electricity. That's $19.99 prices. There's virtually no sea ice on the Norwegian coast, despite the latitude, and that's all because of the Gulf Stream. I think, as most everyone knows, the Gulf Stream gains momentum off Florida, cruises up the east coast, and then fans out under the Grand Banks towards Iceland, Great Britain, and Norway. Due to the Gulf Stream, the average sea temperature was above freezing, and the average air temperature was generally in the mid to upper 20s. Beginning in November, snow fell frequently, but Jaja and I don't mind snow and below freezing temperatures because it's actually easier to live on a boat with snow than with rain. going for walks in the rain is a drag, and going for walks in the snow is fun. And snow means sledding, skiing, and telemark skiing and ice skating. This is the local ski area above the town. Well, after sorting out a few issues with the Norwegian Immigration Department, our first winter in Norway proceeded with equanimity. We met many people through the schools, and we were treated like long-standing members of the community. And in the summer of 2000 was upon us, and it was time to be moving on again. This time we knew exactly where we wanted to go. We were going to leave Lofoten behind, and what we wanted to do was sail as far north on the planet as was possible on a sailboat. And that meant a voyage to the pack ice near 80 degrees north in the group of islands known as Svalbard. As we headed up the Norwegian coast and into the perpetual twilight and night sky, discovered that one of the perks of sailing in the Arctic is the complete lack of darkness. Night watches are a cinch because your night vision isn't ruined. Being able to see around the clock greatly reduces fatigue. The best part about 24 hours of light is coastal sailing takes on new dimension. You can leave a harbor anytime you feel like it and arrive at the next place anytime without the fear of darkness moving in and obscuring landmarks. Sailing in darkness in familiar waters is okay because you have an instinctual knowledge of what the landscape is. But moving around in unfamiliar waters can be risky, especially with so much darkness in the wintertime. But that being said, it's still important to translate your Norwegian tide book correctly and understand that the tide is going down when you thought that it was going up again. Fortunately, the only damage done on this day was to a bottle of wine that we drank while sitting on the beach waiting for the tide to come in. Made it to the north coast, the very extreme north coast of Norway, to Nordkapp, and it was from there that we set sail 400 miles north to Spitsbergen Island, the main island, the biggest island in the Svalbard group. Our passage to Spitsbergen from Norway was reminiscent of our passage from New Zealand to Fiji so many years before. The predicted high-pressure system, which was supposed to dominate the region for several days, drifted on and dominated someplace else. And instead, a low moved in with strong winds, and there were adverse currents and shoals in this region, and we got pounded by wicked seas. The temperature on deck dropped to 34 degrees, and rain changed to snow. I know this sounds like January, but it was actually mid-June. The worst part of all is that all of us, including Jaja this time, were seasick. At one point, Tiga poked her head out from under the blankets and said, "You know what? They should have put the island here, because then we'd be there already." Let's see if this tray works any better. Well, naturally, we were feeling a little bit downhearted on this passage, a familiar scenario for us, actually. And one of the things we do when we are not feeling so great on a passage, but anticipating our arrival, is we think about the splendors of nature that will await us when we arrive. A little mind game we play. We'd heard Spitsbergen was a wild place with nature as the main ingredient. Something we were discovering in our travels is that the farther we got from people, the more diverse the animal populations became. It was kind of people were replaced by animals in bird life, and there was plenty of that in Spitsbergen for us. You don't often see walrus in Boston Harbor. During the storm, we were careful to get some rest and have a cup of coffee and a bite to eat. It's easier to cope with the storm. Seasickness with a clear head and a full stomach. Well, and the seasickness is so bad that you can't eat, and food and drink are impossible. We try to ask ourselves some questions such as, is the boat in danger? Is there enough sea room? Can we reduce sail, slow the boat down, and just drift until conditions improve or we feel better? Well, if you are seasick, you have to be very careful not to ask yourself this question: am I going to die? Because the answer you come up with might be yes, followed by, what the heck's taking so long? Well, our entire 6-week cruise in Spitsbergen was full of magic. Began the day we made landfall and wrapped it up to some leftover, to some fjord ice. Chris said it was like being tied to a cement dock, but I'm not so certain it was. As you can see, he is tied on. We're somewhat responsible parents. But tied up next to this drift ice, 3 polar bears had spotted us, a mother and 2 cubs, and came charging across toward us, and we quickly moved into free water. It hadn't occurred to us that while laying next to the ice, a bear could just saunter up to us, stick his head over the lifelines, and have a feed. But polar bears reside at the top of the food chain, putting all tourists at a disadvantage during meal times. And the Norwegian government acknowledges this threat and requires all visitors to carry a weapon with them at all times. Jaja's got a gun slung on her back here as we go marching across the tundra. Those are polar bear tracks to Jaja's left that she's following. As I said, she has the gun and I have the camera, which is why I'm behind. Interesting to note that on this peninsula there are the remains of 400-year-old earthen rings that the Dutch had used for boiling whale blubber. 400 years uncovered, and they were still there. Erosion is a slow process in the Arctic, and our footprints would probably remain for some time alongside those polar bears. We had rented a .30 caliber rifle before leaving Norway, and this gun turned out actually to be a piece of junk. While shooting at some fishing floats on a deserted beach, the stock of the gun splintered into a bunch of little wooden pieces. And you can see here that Jaja's cheating. She's in front of the line that I've drawn in the sand. It serves her right. I'm certain the gun shop owner must have earmarked that rifle for a cruising sailor because I found myself later putting that gun back together with clamps and epoxy. You know what it said about ingenuity. We saw a polar bear later that day while the glue was drying on the gun. But fortunately, we were on the boat. On the 4th of July, year 2000, we left this anchorage at Amsterdamria Island, where the earthen rings still exist after so many years. And we struck out for the northern limits, or the southern limits, depends how you look at it, the limits of the pack ice. The wind remained light and the sky clear. I don't know why we're so determined to try and cross 80 degrees north latitude. After all, it's just a number on the chart. As we approached the pack ice, we realized with the shock that we'd reached the end of our northern trek, 3 years of voyaging north. All we could see was a sheet of ice stretching northward. Unless we had an icebreaker, there was no going farther. We're now nearly 800 miles north of Iceland, 800 miles north of our original goal, and a mere 600 or so miles from the North Pole. 4-year-old Tiga, 8-year-old Holly, and 10-year-old Chris stood on deck staring at the ice. You'd think we'd have been shouting and jumping in this moment, but it was inward time. time of reflection for us. And anyway, the calm aura of the Arctic doesn't seem conducive to such jubilation. And after all, if sailing to the pack ice was akin to climbing a mountain, we still had to get back down again. And statistically, expeditions usually come to grief on the return journey when the adrenaline rush has faded, supplies are low, and you're just a little bit more worn out than you were before. So we sat at the pack ice for a little while, absorbing our geographic position. And as we turned drivers southward and pushed the tiller hard over, we knew at that point that one voyage had ended and a new voyage had just begun. No voyage ever ends without something good coming from it. Well, from Spitsbergen, maybe 3 years before we actually made it back to the States. So here are some highlights of the return journey. Well, we returned to the Lofoten group for a second winter in the town of Svolvær, where we had been given a cultural visa. And instead of living on the boat, we hauled the boat and rented a 700 square foot uninsulated summer cabin. You have to admit the location was gorgeous, even if the inside temperature was only around 50 degrees. We couldn't turn the heaters up all the way, the electric ones, because they would blow the main fuse. So we just got used to wearing sweaters and wool socks and long underwear in the house. But it wasn't so bad. If we wanted to go outside, all we had to do was put on a coat and boots. Jaja joined the Svolvær Symphony Orchestra, playing cello, something she'd learned to do as a kid. Well, by now, Jaja was getting pretty good at speaking Norwegian, but she had a hard time understanding the conductor. Jaja asked the other cellist, why is his Norwegian so difficult to understand? And the cellist laughed and said, oh, that's because he's speaking Swedish. A year later, still traveling south, we crossed the Norwegian Sea to the tiny island known as Jan Mayen. And it was on this 4-day crossing that we saw more whales than we'd ever seen before. With 24 hours of light, there was always spume on the horizon, and we saw a pod of orca, sperm whales, right whales, humpbacks, and it was truly a magic time to see so many whales concentrated and so few whaling boats. Well, Jan Mayen's a special place because you can only get ashore on that beach over there on the right in settled conditions. We anchored the boat, and luck was on our side. We were able to land the dinghy through light surf and get to the spectacular volcanic landscape. The next afternoon, we sailed down the coast another 15 miles or so and re-anchored in another small, what was called a bay, but was actually an indentation with big surf rolling in. And we actually managed to get to shore and visit the engineers who maintain the Loran Sea Station on Jan Mayen. They invited us ashore, and first thing they did is they shot us off to their heated swimming pool, and then they gave us beers and cokes. And after a swim, they sent us off to the showers and a sauna. And when we emerged clean and refreshed, the station commander came up to us and invited us to be his guests for dinner at the canteen. Well, we must have smelled really bad when we first got to shore. From Jan Mayen, we sailed back to Iceland. We hadn't seen our friends Ate and Gudni in almost 2 years. Well, they still had the tube of toothpaste and the toothbrushes we'd sent to them from Norway one Christmas. The card we sent with the toothbrushes read, "To be used for cleaning the sheep's teeth before placing the head on the table." Well, we had to wait 3 weeks in Iceland for the icebergs on Greenland's east coast to thin out. It was a late ice year. Our destination was a system of fjords on Greenland's southern coast, known as Prince Christiansund. You can see a face in that iceberg, kind of in the middle. Looks like Gollum, actually. "40 miles off the coast, we encountered this band of icebergs after a 5-day passage from Iceland. It was a little bit unnerving to put ourselves into this predicament of going into the ice. The biggest problem were the growlers, chunks of ice about the size of the boat and nearly invisible. The larger icebergs can be picked up on radar, but these small chunks float nearly awash and do not get picked up on radar, and you can only see them with enough visibility. As we entered this parade of bergs traveling south, navigation became more and more precarious. The problem was we had 6 hours of darkness now that we were south of the Arctic Circle, and our biggest fear was fog. Halfway through the ice maze, if the fog came down, we would not be able to go forward nor go back. And just to add spice to the day, a gale was forecasted for the next afternoon. A little bit stressful getting to the Greenland coast, but gorgeous. Fortunately, later that afternoon, we made our way into the fjord system, and you can see Driver in the bottom right-hand corner, anchored in this area. The trick when anchoring near icebergs is to get the boat in as shallow of water as possible. That way the big icebergs run aground before hitting you. And we had an anchor in 110 feet of water. The boat was in 25 feet of water, and we had a stern line ashore. The icebergs in front of us are hard aground. By morning, the fog had come down, and the gale was blowing, and we'd made it with 1 day to spare. This fjord, Prince Christiansund Fjord, cutting across the south of the island, with spectacular anchorages every night and plenty of deep water. We tied next to a mountain underneath a glacial waterfall, melt waterfall, and filled our water tanks with, I think, some of the sweetest water we've ever tasted. We thought our experiences with ice in Greenland would be the end of our ice episodes, but the most intense was yet to come, actually. We didn't get away from Greenland until September 1st, and across the Davis Strait to Labrador, and we were heading down the coast of Newfoundland through the Gulf of St. Lawrence late September, and the gales were pounding us, and we were getting more worn out. So we decided we need to be spontaneous. So we stopped at the west coast town of Corner Brook in southern Newfoundland and found a safe place for the boat for the winter. And we also found schools and enrolled our kids in the Newfie schools. Now, I can remember asking the fishermen in this small boat harbor if ice would be a problem. And they said, "No, bye. We don't get 3 feet of ice like in the old days. No, sir. Now we only get 2 or 3 inches." Well, when March rolled around and the fishermen came down to the harbor and saw a Driver locked in 3 feet of ice, they just nudged each other in the ribs and said, "Yes, sir, buddy, would you look at that? Just like in the old days." Well, for us, as you can see, cruising is more than just a trip on our boat. It's more of a way of life. Jaja is fond of saying that the lows are often zeros, but the highs are all tens. We've learned that next year's impossible destination can quickly become last year's accomplishment. We've also learned that it's okay to be uncomfortable at times and a little bit scared, because hardship increases the value of the easier times. And I will admit that moving from place to place has been somewhat of an obsession for us. But the thrill of travel is immeasurable because there is always something new over the horizon, just out of sight. Thank you very much.
Let's take just a few questions, and then Dave will be happy to sign some books out in the lobby if people would like to purchase them. But let's take just a few minutes for questions. If anybody has any.
Yeah, if there's any questions, usually more than willing.
Yes. Where are you going next?
Pardon?
Where are you going next?
We like to go to the southern hemisphere, Antarctica, Falkland Islands, Tierra del Fuego, and see if the ice is any different down there. See penguins instead of polar bears might be a more pleasurable experience. Pardon? No, we'll go for Cape Horn. I mean, raw. But that's what Jaja wants to do anyway. That's her plan. But, yeah.
How did you keep each other from killing each other this long?
We had 4. We only have 3 now. We do things differently. We don't have television, videos, DVDs, whatever you call them now. And up till very recently, we didn't have any kind of, we're a laptop computer, but during the trip, we didn't have any electronics in the boat. So we read, we play games, and we're very close as a family. We interact really well together. I mean, in fact, Holly, who's just turned 13, and Tiga, who's 8, play together every day. They'd rather play with each other than have their own friends. It's a very special bond that our kids have. And although they do squibble and squabble and bicker and, which is, we all do it, they get along pretty well. And we're happy we've given them that, if nothing else, that a sibling bond that hopefully they can carry into their adult lives. And one thing our kids, people ask all the time is, do the kids get scared? And I always tell them that the kids don't get scared as long as Jaja and me keep our cool. The kids don't know any better. It's like, oh, this must be normal. It's 50-knot winds and the big seas. This is great. They had a game where the bow is like this, and they had a game where they would put their socks on and walk across the tilted cabin sole 14 feet from the companionway to the V-berth. And the game was you couldn't touch anything. You just had to get it on with socks. And the kids don't get scared by the rough conditions because who do you see at amusement parks going on rides with puke factors of 10? Kids. So a boat's just a natural thing. Did you have a question?
Do you have an engine?
Yes. On our steel boat, we have a 28-horse Volvo diesel, which in the high latitudes, an engine is, for us, important. The wind is either building up to a gale or dying out from a gale, and you're left with the calms in between. So if you spend a lot of time drifting, you know the next thing coming will be a lot of strong wind. And you have to make a choice. You can either spend all your time fighting to make the boat move forward with no wind and then too much wind, or you can put on the motor and get to your destination and enjoy the reason for us that we're out there, which is to get to the place and enjoy the people. So in the high latitudes, we tended to motor when the wind was calm to get us where we're going. On our 25-foot boat, we had an outboard engine that we almost never used. The tropics, the wind blows, small boats sail very well. So we're not purists by any means.
But they did have a long spell without wind when you were...
Yes, on the 25-foot boat, we had a fuel capacity of 30 miles with the outboard. So when you have 2,700 miles to go, 12 miles, or it just doesn't make much difference. So, and I don't use the engine to charge batteries. I use solar, and with the small boat, the advantage in the tropics without an engine, if you have an engine, you're going to use it. I mean, let's just face it. You have a car in the driveway, you're going to walk 5 miles to the store? No, you're going to drive your car. You don't have a car? No, you walk. So we use the engine, and then you miss the quiet and the silence. You don't hear the whales. You don't hear the birds, the feathers rustling on the breeze, 30 yards away, because it can be so quiet you can hear everything. So the engine is a mixed blessing. You miss the nature, which is why we have a rowing dinghy, a 10-foot dinghy that I made, with no engine on it, because you get into the dinghy, you spend a lot of time going to the boat, to shore, and back, and that is our family time. We're all together in the same place, and we can talk. We have conversations, and you can hear other people talking about you, which is really fascinating Otherwise, if you have an outboard, you're screaming, "Hey, look at that ugly boat over there!" Then everyone can hear your conversation and you're screaming. So we try and perpetuate silence in our lives because it's amazing what you hear if you can let go of noise. Yeah.
I decide, like you want to leave, you know how long you're going to be out there, you go by the weather conditions. How long, because you said you had to,
yeah.
And I was pulling in, you had to put the boat in there, and then go take your kids, go up the road.
Yeah, the question was weather planning. Pardon? Yeah, the question is weather planning and route planning. Route planning, I guess, would be part of it. The way to be safe on a small boat is you have to understand the climate. You have to understand what you're getting yourself into at what time of the year. You don't sail to the Caribbean in August, because there's going to be hurricanes and tropical depressions. You wait till November. Hopefully the gales are behind. Going to Iceland, you wait. We followed the late spring gales out. We got to the summer when the highs move in and utilize the summer conditions when the frequency of gales is less. September comes, the gales are coming, it's time to be somewhere. And knowing what the weather conditions are going to be and what to expect, we can plan for the conditions and we can be as safe as possible. And also anticipating route times, how much diesel, how much water, how much food. We usually carry enough for 4 months, which is going to do you about most conditions. So we... Yeah, we do. We keep in touch with everyone. Yeah, I'm emailing Icelandic friends this morning. And special bonds, pardon me, that we created that hopefully will last forever.
Do you get insurance for this?
Insurance. That's a naughty, naughty word. It really is. I hate insurance. We have it on the car and had to get it for the house. But we don't have health insurance. We don't have boat insurance. I have car insurance because I'm made to get it, and it's a good idea. If we had health insurance and boat insurance, we would not be cruising. We'd be working, paying for the insurance. So it's a real vicious cycle, this insurance thing. We are not risk takers. We play the odds and would rather take a chance. I mean, if you have insurance, this doesn't insure your life. I mean, if you fall in the water, you're going to drown. It doesn't care how much boat insurance you have or health insurance. So you're not going to die, and the insurance doesn't have anything to do with that. So you might be taking a financial risk, and we would rather take that risk and see something than sit at home and fret about this material thing that we might not. If we have it and you can't use it, what's the point in having it? I don't like insurance, but it's required. Don't get me started.
Let's take one last question before, and then we'll move, and there's some refreshments so people can stay around and ask questions.
Yeah.
One
One last question.
I was going to ask how you schedule your watches.
Our watch scheduling on the boat, 3 on, 3 off is the dream watch, but it doesn't usually work like that. The kids wake up at 8 and go to bed at 9 on the boat. It's just like home. And so they sleep all night long, and they're up all day. So Jaja primarily takes care of the kids during the day. I stay awake between midnight. I take the dog watch midnight to 6. I'm awake when they're asleep. And then I take cat naps during the day. And then Jaja's up with the kids, and she can watch when I'm sleeping. And we kind of rotate it like that. We're very informal. If, for instance, Jaja's sound asleep and I'm awake, I won't wake her up because it's my turn to sleep. If a person's sleeping, they're recharging. They need to go. And I can just bully through it. And likewise, if I'm out, she won't wake me up. You can always stay awake another half hour, but that extra half hour sleep could be the difference of life and death as far as recharging your psyche. As John mentioned, I'm just babbling on here. So we have a book, Into the Light, which chronicles our journey a little more detail and a little more succinctly than I can do it speaking up here. We go into the people we meet and some more of our ideas about the planet and how we feel about the way things are going. So I would be happy to sign that for you. And other than that, thank you for coming out here tonight, and I've enjoyed talking to all of you. Thank you.